My name is Emma. I'm in my early 30s now, and for most of my life, I've been someone people describe as steady, low maintenance, or easy to rely on. I work in a profession that rewards patience and quiet thinking. I don't take up much space in a room. I listen more than I speak. And because of that, people often assume they know exactly who I am and how far they can push me. This story isn't about drama, it isn't about revenge, and it's not about a villain and a hero. It's about a moment when love was reframed as control, and silence became the only place I could think clearly. The sentence that changed everything came from my mother. My mother threatened to disown me unless I married a man I had never met. She didn't raise her voice when she said it. She didn't insult me. She didn't even sound angry. That's what made it so hard to recognize what it was. She called it family duty, but it was an ultimatum. Choose a stranger for life, or lose my mother forever. If you met me back then, you might have thought I was unaffected. I still went to work. I still answered messages politely. I still showed up to family events and smiled at the right moments. What people often misunderstand about quiet people is that silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Sometimes it means everything is. This story traces the slow internal journey from being the reliable daughter to becoming someone who could no longer be controlled by fear of loss. There are no shouting matches here, no dramatic walkouts, no sudden triumphs. What happened unfolded gradually, through observation, restraint, and a decision that couldn't be undone once it was made. I'm sharing this not to punish anyone, including my mother. I'm sharing it because emotional coercion often hides behind familiar words: duty, sacrifice, family, tradition. And when it's quiet, it's harder to name and easier to accept for far too long. You'll hear how small dismissals became normalized, how expectations were assigned without discussion, how silence was mistaken for agreement, and how eventually clarity arrived. Not with anger, but with an unexpected calm. I'm telling this story honestly, without embellishment, because I believe there's value in understanding how power shifts without confrontation, how dignity can be reclaimed without cruelty, and how sometimes the most decisive moments in our lives happen without anyone else noticing until it's too late. If you've ever been loved in a way that felt conditional, if you've ever been praised for being easy when what it really meant was compliant, then you may recognize parts of yourself in what comes next. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever been asked to sacrifice your future in the name of someone else's idea of love? For most of my life, I was useful in a very specific way. Not impressive, not difficult, just useful. In my family, usefulness was a quiet currency. It wasn't talked about openly, but everyone understood it. You earned your place by being agreeable, by not creating complications, by absorbing inconvenience so others didn't have to. I learned early that I was good at this. Too good. I was the daughter who never caused scenes, the one who adjusted. If plans changed at the last minute, I adapted. If someone needed help moving, translating paperwork, or proofreading an email, I was there. I remembered birthdays without reminders. I noticed tensions before they surfaced and smoothed them over before anyone else had to acknowledge them. People called me thoughtful. What they really meant was predictable. In family gatherings, I was rarely the center of attention, and that was considered a compliment. Emma doesn't need much, my mother would say, usually with a fond smile. She's independent. The irony of that word would take years to fully reveal itself. I didn't push back when decisions were made without me. Holidays, relocations, and financial priorities. These were often announced rather than discussed. I told myself it was because I was flexible, mature, low drama. Those are flattering labels, and they're easy to accept when you want to believe you're choosing silence rather than being assigned to it. My mother, in particular, had a way of framing things as facts of life rather than choices. She was efficient, practical, deeply invested in appearances and legacy. She believed family was a structure that had to be maintained, sometimes at the expense of individual preference. She didn't see that as cruelty. She saw it as a responsibility. And I was the child most suited to carry it. Not because I was the strongest, but because I was the least likely to resist. At work, people often underestimated me in a similar way. I wasn't the loudest voice in meetings. I didn't interrupt. I didn't perform with confidence, but I noticed patterns others missed. I remembered details. I prepared quietly and thoroughly. When problems arose months later, my notes were often the only ones that mattered. Still, I was rarely described as ambitious. Again, useful, not threatening. This combination, being competent but unobtrusive, made people comfortable around me. They assumed I would stay where they placed me, that I wouldn't suddenly change the rules. And for a long time, they were right. I told myself that being unseen was a kind of freedom, that not being scrutinized meant I could live as I liked. But the truth was more subtle. When no one is watching closely, they also don't ask what you want. They assume you'll fit yourself around what already exists. In my family, I was the adaptable piece, the one that bent so the structure didn't crack. I didn't feel oppressed. That's important to say. There was no single moment of obvious injustice, no dramatic denial, just a slow accumulation of assumptions about who I was and what I would tolerate. I was the daughter who would understand, the one who would see reason, the one who wouldn't make things difficult. That identity became so familiar that I stopped questioning whether it was something I had chosen or something that had been quietly chosen for me. Looking back, what stands out most isn't mistreatment, it's invisibility. Not the kind that hurts immediately, but the kind that settles in over time. The kind where your silence is mistaken for agreement and your flexibility is interpreted as consent. By the time the ultimatum came years later, it didn't arrive out of nowhere. It landed on a foundation that had been carefully laid, brick, by expectations I had never formally accepted, but had also never refused. At that point in my life, if you had asked anyone in my family who I was, they would have answered confidently. They would have said they knew me well. What they didn't realize was that they knew a version of me shaped by convenience. And neither of us had yet discovered what would happen when that version quietly stepped aside. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. That's what makes it easy to dismiss in hindsight, to call it a coincidence, or misunderstanding, or oversensitivity. If it had been larger, louder, or more obvious, I might have reacted. But it wasn't. It was small, precise, almost polite. It happened over lunch with my mother on an ordinary afternoon that was meant to be casual. We were sitting near a window, light spilling across the table, talking about unremarkable things, work, a cousin's recent engagement, the cost of travel. Nothing tense, nothing loaded, or so I thought. At some point, she mentioned a family friend's son. Just in passing, his job, his education, how well he was settled. I listened without much interest. This wasn't unusual. My mother often catalogued people's lives as if they were entries in a ledger, marriages, promotions, relocations, data points that helped her make sense of the world. Then she said, almost conversationally, "He's the kind of man a woman like you should consider." I remember the way she said should, not as advice, as a conclusion. I smiled politely and changed the subject. That was my instinctive response, to smooth, to redirect, to avoid creating friction where none was necessary. At least, that's what I told myself. But something about that sentence stayed with me. Not because of the man. I didn't care who he was. What unsettled me was the framing. A woman like you. As if I belonged to a category with defined boundaries. As if my future could be inferred from my temperament alone. I told myself I was reading too much into it. Later, when I mentioned the comment to a close friend, she laughed. "She's just being a mum," she said. "They all do that." And she wasn't wrong. Many parents make careless remarks, guided more by their own anxieties than their children's realities. So I let it go. But I noticed that similar comments began to appear, spaced just far enough apart to feel unconnected. A reference to timing. A remark about how choices narrow after a certain age. A suggestion that independence is easier when shared. Each comment on its own was harmless. Together they formed a pattern. What struck me most was how no one reacted. Not my siblings, not other relatives. The comments landed in the open, unchallenged, as if they were observations rather than propositions, and because I didn't object, they settled into the background noise of family conversation. Silence can be a powerful collaborator. At the time, I thought my lack of response was maturity. I believed I was choosing not to engage in speculative conversations about a future I hadn't yet defined. But in reality, my silence was being interpreted as openness, or worse, availability. The first small cut wasn't about marriage, it was about an assumption. It was the moment someone else began sketching the outline of my life without asking for permission, and discovered there was no immediate resistance. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, surfacing in moments of discomfort I brushed aside. a tightening in my chest when certain topics arose, a growing reluctance to share personal details, an instinct to keep parts of my life unspoken, not out of secrecy, but self-preservation. I didn't confront my mother. I didn't correct her. I didn't even acknowledge the implication aloud. I simply started to pay attention. That was the real shift. Because once you notice the first small cut, you start to see the others. And you realize that what's being tested isn't your agreement, but your boundaries. At that stage, I still believed things would resolve themselves naturally. That clarity would emerge without conflict, that no one would push too far. After all, nothing had been demanded, nothing explicit had been said. But boundaries that aren't named are often treated as optional, and I had just demonstrated without meaning to that mine could be approached quietly, patiently, and without resistance. Once something is introduced softly enough, it doesn't feel like an intrusion. It feels like an atmosphere. The comments didn't escalate quickly. They didn't need to. They became part of the background, woven into conversations the way weather updates or traffic complaints are. Always present, never urgent. At family dinners, someone would ask about my work, then gently pivot. So, are you seeing anyone seriously? If I answered vaguely, the conversation would drift on. If I said no, there would be a pause. Not disapproval, just a quiet recalibration, followed by reassurance disguised as concern. You've always been focused, my aunt once said, as if that explained everything. My mother nodded. She's sensible. She'll settle when the time is right. Settle. The word carried weight, though no one acknowledged it. It suggested resolution, containment, and an end to movement. It implied that whatever I was doing now was temporary, something to be outgrown. I learned to respond with neutral phrases. I'm happy where I am. I'm not in a rush. We'll see. These answers were received with indulgent smiles, as if I were humoring them with a phase they fully expected to pass. And because the reactions were gentle, I told myself I was being respected. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as an attack, it arrives as familiarity. Over time, I noticed how my preferences were increasingly spoken about in the past tense. My independence was framed as a chapter, rather than a foundation. Decisions I hadn't made were discussed as if they were merely delayed. What unsettled me most wasn't the pressure, it was the certainty. No one asked if I wanted the life they envisioned. They spoke as though my consent was a formality, something that would naturally align once presented with the right option. A suitable man, a reasonable arrangement, a life that made sense. I began to feel like a placeholder in my own future. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of it was loyalty. My mother had sacrificed a great deal to give us stability, and she wore those sacrifices like credentials. Disagreeing with her felt ungrateful. Another part was fear, not of conflict, but of misinterpretation. I worried that asserting myself would be seen as rejection rather than self-definition. And there was something else, more uncomfortable to admit. I had been rewarded my entire life for being accommodating. I was praised for being easy, for not needing much, for understanding without explanation. That kind of praise is addictive, especially when it's tied to love. You don't want to be the one who suddenly becomes difficult. You don't want to risk being labeled selfish when you've spent years being valued for the opposite. So I rationalized. I told myself they meant well, that cultural expectations played a role, that time would soften their assumptions, that once they saw I was truly content, the commentary would fade. But contentment isn't always visible from the outside, especially when others are invested in a different outcome. The more I stayed silent, the more confident they became. Not louder, just firmer. Plans were mentioned casually, then with increasing specificity. Names appeared more often. Logistics were floated under the guise of curiosity. And each time I chose calm over correction. I see now that my silence wasn't neutral. It was interpreted. When you don't object, people assume alignment. When you don't challenge a narrative, it becomes a shared reality. And when you've spent years being the agreeable one, your refusal, when it finally comes, feels to others like a betrayal rather than a boundary. At the time, though, I didn't feel disrespected. I felt managed, as if my life was being gently guided toward a conclusion others had already agreed upon. I wasn't being forced, I was being ushered, and I let it happen, because it was easier than interrupting the flow, because I believed my autonomy was intact, as long as no one said the quiet parts out loud. But disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like being spoken for instead of spoken to. Sometimes it sounds like certainty where curiosity should be. And sometimes it settles in so slowly that you only recognize it once it feels normal. By the time I began to sense that something fundamental was being decided without me, the pattern was already established. And patterns, once normalized, are much harder to break than a single offense ever would be. Roles don't usually come with contracts. They form quietly, through repetition, through what you accept, through what you don't interrupt. By the time you notice them, they already feel permanent. I realized my role one evening during a family gathering that should have been forgettable. Nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a conversation that continued as if I weren't fully present. Plans were being discussed. Future plans. A wedding, though no date had been set. Not my wedding in explicit terms, but a hypothetical one that everyone seemed comfortable projecting onto me. Guest lists were mentioned, venues compared. My preferences weren't asked for, but they were spoken about anyway. "She wouldn't want anything extravagant," my mother said confidently. "She's practical," someone else added. "And flexible," my aunt concluded, as if sealing the matter. I sat there, nodding faintly, feeling oddly detached. It was like watching people furnish a house I hadn't agreed to live in. That was the moment it became clear. I wasn't being pressured because I was difficult to convince. I was chosen because I was easy to assign. I was the reliable daughter, the reasonable one, the one who would see the bigger picture and make the necessary sacrifice so everything else could stay intact. Others in my family had sharper edges, stronger opinions, louder reactions. Their resistance was expected, even accommodated. Mine was not. I had been typecast. Once you're in a role like that, everything you do is interpreted through it. My silence was maturity. My hesitation was modesty. My lack of enthusiasm was just my calm nature. There was no room in their perception for refusal, only delay. What unsettled me wasn't that they were wrong about some of my traits. I was practical, I was thoughtful, I did value stability. What unsettled me was how those qualities were being used to justify decisions made on my behalf. I began to see how often my needs were postponed because I could handle it. How often my consent was assumed because I had never made a scene. How often my adaptability was mistaken for availability. And still, I didn't correct them. Part of me feared that stepping out of the role would fracture something essential, that I would be blamed for the disruption. That love would become conditional the moment I stopped being convenient. So I played my part. I listened. I nodded. I offered non-answers. I told myself that as long as nothing was finalized, I wasn't obligated to react, that I still had time. But roles have momentum. And once everyone agrees on who you are, your resistance feels like defiance, even when it's simply self-respect. The most painful realization wasn't that they misunderstood me. It was that they didn't feel the need to ask, because in their minds, my role had already answered for me. I went home that night and sat alone in my flat, replaying the conversation in fragments, not with anger, but with a growing sense of clarity. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a question I had avoided for years. What would happen if I didn't fulfill the role they had written for me? I didn't know the answer yet. But I knew this much. The person they were planning for wasn't fully me. She was a version shaped by expectation, reinforced by silence, and sustained by my reluctance to disappoint. That realization didn't make me act immediately, but it marked the end of something. The end of pretending that my compliance was accidental. The end of believing that my role was harmless. The end of assuming that love, once given, could not be withdrawn. From that point on, I began to understand that roles can only exist as long as someone agrees to perform them. And I was no longer certain I could. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where everything suddenly became clear. In fact, it happened on a day that looked almost identical to dozens of others. I was alone. It was a quiet morning, the kind that feels suspended between obligation and intention. No urgent messages, no deadlines pressing down, just a rare stretch of uninterrupted time. I remember standing in my kitchen, holding a mug I hadn't started drinking yet, staring out the window without really seeing anything. And then a thought surfaced. Not dramatic, not even fully formed. If I agree to this, my life will no longer be mine. The simplicity of it startled me. Not my time, not my freedom, my life. Until then, I had treated the situation as a series of manageable conversations. something that could be negotiated, softened, or delayed. But that morning, for the first time, I let myself consider the outcome as permanent. A marriage I hadn't chosen, a future structured around someone else's expectations, a relationship entered not out of desire, but obligation. The realization wasn't accompanied by fear. It was quieter than that. It felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible and finally acknowledging where it led. I didn't feel anger toward my mother. I didn't feel resentment. What I felt was distance, a subtle emotional step back that allowed me to see the situation without the familiar fog of guilt. I thought about the man I was being encouraged to marry. A stranger, reduced to credentials and compatibility metrics. I wasn't repulsed by the idea of him. That, too, was telling. Indifference can be more dangerous than dislike. I asked myself a question I had avoided until then. If no one were watching, would I choose this? The answer arrived immediately. No, that was all. No justification, no explanation, just a clear internal refusal. And with it came another realization, equally unsettling. If I said no openly, there would be consequences. Not dramatic ones, perhaps, but emotional ones. Withdrawal, disappointment, distance. I had always known this in theory. That morning I accepted it as fact. What changed wasn't my circumstances. What changed was my relationship to them. I stopped framing the situation as something happening to me and started seeing it as a choice being offered under pressure. That distinction mattered. It restored a sense of agency I hadn't realized I'd lost. I didn't tell anyone about this shift. There was no need. It was internal, private, and fragile. Announcing it would have invited interference, so I protected it with silence. From that day on, my quietness took on a different quality. It was no longer avoidance. It was containment. I listened more carefully, not to respond, but to understand. I observed how decisions were framed, how often love was invoked alongside expectation, how frequently sacrifice was praised but rarely shared equally. And I noticed something else. The more I withdrew emotionally, the more confident others became. They mistook my calm for compliance, my lack of protest for acceptance. In a strange way, their certainty increased as my resolve solidified. That was when I understood something fundamental. Silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it's the space where a decision finishes forming. By the end of that day, nothing in my external life had changed. I still answered messages, I still went to work, I still spoke kindly to my mother. But internally, a line had been crossed. I no longer saw myself as someone waiting to be guided toward the right outcome. I saw myself as someone preparing, quietly, deliberately to choose. And once that shift occurred, there was no going back to who I had been before. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, an instinctive way to keep the peace, to avoid friction, to remain in good standing. Now it was intentional, measured, chosen. I didn't announce anything. I didn't withdraw dramatically. I simply stopped offering access to my inner process. My thoughts stayed with me. My plans remained unspoken. And for the first time, that felt like strength rather than avoidance. People often assume silence is emptiness. In reality, it can be densely occupied. I listened more than ever, not just to words, but to patterns, to timing, to what was emphasized and what was skipped over. I noticed how often my mother framed her expectations as inevitabilities, how she spoke about outcomes as though they were already agreed upon. "She'll understand," she would say to others, even when I was present. "She always does." I let those statements pass without correction, not because they were true, but because correcting them prematurely would have changed nothing. I was no longer interested in convincing anyone. I was interested in preparing myself. At work, my demeanor didn't change much. If anything, I became even more composed. I met deadlines. I participated when necessary. I kept my personal life vague. Colleagues read this as a focus, stability, reliability. No one suspected that I was restructuring my internal priorities. At home, my mother grew more confident. She began speaking with increasing specificity. Timelines appeared in conversation. Introductions were hinted at, then discussed openly. Each step forward was presented as a natural progression rather than an escalation. And still I didn't react. This is the part that's often misunderstood when people hear stories like this. They imagine silence as fear, as paralysis, as a weakness. But there is a point where silence stops being imposed and starts being strategic. I had reached that point. I wasn't waiting for permission. I wasn't hoping for circumstances to change. I was allowing others to reveal themselves fully, without interruption. When people believe you won't resist, they stop hiding their assumptions. That gave me clarity. I saw how little room there was for negotiation, how conditional affection could become when expectations were challenged, how easily concern could turn into control when obedience was threatened. And because I wasn't pushing back, none of it was disguised anymore. My mother began to frame the situation more starkly, though still calmly. She spoke about duty, about responsibility, about how some choices aren't really choices at all. I absorbed every word without comment. Internally, I was no longer debating what I wanted. That question had been settled. I was now considering how to move forward without detonating everything at once. I knew confrontation would be expected. Emotional appeals, tears, raised voices. Those were the scripts people anticipated. And because they anticipated them, they were prepared to counter them. What they weren't prepared for was restraint. I continued to behave as the version of me they believed in, reasonable, composed, compliant. That illusion bought me time, and time, in this situation, was leverage. Silence also protected me from being manipulated through guilt. Once you state a position openly, others respond to it. They argue, they persuade, they reframe. By staying quiet, I denied them that entry point. Instead, I observed. I planned. I aligned my actions with my values privately, rather than defending them publicly. There was a strange calm in this phase. Not peace, but clarity. I slept better than I had in months. My thoughts were orderly. The noise of obligation faded, replaced by a steady internal rhythm. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing when to be seen. And while everyone else interpreted my composure as acquiescence, I was quietly stepping out of the role they had assigned me, one deliberate, unremarkable day at a time. They believed they were guiding me toward a conclusion. In reality, I was preparing for a departure. What people rarely understand about quiet people is that we don't stop thinking just because we stop speaking. If anything, the opposite is true. While everyone around me grew more confident in their assumptions, my attention sharpened. I began to document, not obsessively, not emotionally, but methodically. I kept notes the way I always had, in the slim notebook I carried everywhere. At first, it was instinct. Later, it became an intention. Dates, exact wording, who said what and in whose presence. Not because I planned to confront anyone with it. I didn't even know yet what I would do with the information. But I had learned enough about power to understand one thing. Clarity favors the prepared. I also began learning quietly. I read about family law, not in a dramatic, crisis-driven way, but academically, casually. I framed it as general interest if anyone asked. Marriage contracts, financial interdependence, immigration implications. Social expectations are embedded in legal structures. The parts people assume will work themselves out. They don't. I had spent years analyzing policies at work, long-term consequences disguised as benign decisions. I applied the same lens to my own life. Once I did, the situation looked very different. Marriage, I realized, wasn't just emotional. It was structural. It redistributed power, resources, and autonomy in ways that were difficult to reverse, especially when entered under pressure, especially when one party began from a position of obligation rather than desire. No one around me talked about that. They talked about stability, respectability, family harmony, as if those were natural outcomes rather than negotiated ones. I also began to reposition myself financially. Quiet adjustments, increased savings, reduced shared dependencies. Nothing that would raise suspicion, just small, consistent steps towards self-sufficiency. At work, I accepted a project that required more responsibility, something long-term, with visibility. It wasn't ambitious in a flashy way, but it deepened my leverage. It made me harder to dismiss, harder to uproot. No one noticed these changes because they didn't disrupt the image they had of me. I was still calm, still agreeable, still not making things difficult. That was the blind spot. People tend to monitor resistance, not preparation. The more I complied outwardly, the less anyone questioned my internal alignment. Conversations grew more confident. Assumptions are more explicit. My mother spoke as though the outcome was already settled. She even began referencing sacrifices she was making for me, how much effort this process took, how much she had invested emotionally. I listened without correcting the narrative. In truth, every time she spoke that way, she confirmed something I needed to know. This wasn't about my happiness. It was about control framed as care. And because I wasn't arguing, she had no reason to recalibrate. I also noticed how often my boundaries were tested indirectly. Emotional hypotheticals, statements about loyalty, casual remarks about what kind of daughter I was, or should be. Each one was a probe, checking for resistance. I offered none. Not because I agreed, but because I was already past the point of negotiation. This phase wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost boring from the outside. Life went on. Work, errands, family calls. Nothing visibly shifted. But underneath, something irreversible was taking shape. I wasn't preparing to rebel. I was preparing to exit a system that had mistaken my silence for consent. And the most important part, the part no one noticed, was that I stopped needing validation. Once you no longer seek permission to choose your life, the fear of disappointing others loses its grip. They still thought they were managing me. In reality, I was finishing my assessment. And when you finish assessing a situation like that, what comes next is not an argument. It's a decision. The moment of clarity didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with stillness. I had been accumulating information for months. Legal frameworks, financial implications, patterns of communication, emotional leverage points. None of it felt explosive on its own. But one evening, sitting alone with my notebook open, the fragments aligned. And I saw it. Not a dramatic revelation, not a secret uncovered, a structural truth. My mother's power over me existed almost entirely in one place: access. Access to family, access to belonging, access to the version of love I had been taught was irreplaceable. There were no legal shackles, no financial dependence that couldn't be undone, no practical barriers I couldn't navigate. What remained was emotional leverage, power that only functioned if I continued to value it above my own autonomy. That was the private reveal. The threat of disownment only works if exile is unbearable. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. Not because it frightened me, but because it clarified the cost of freedom. If I chose myself, I would lose something real, not symbolically, tangibly. And I had to decide whether that loss would destroy me or simply change me. I thought about my childhood, about moments of warmth that were genuine. At times, my mother had shown care in ways she understood. I didn't want to rewrite our history as cruelty. That would have been dishonest. But I also couldn't ignore the present. Love that requires obedience isn't safety. It's a contract, and one that can be revoked. Once I saw that clearly, something unexpected happened. The fear dissolved. Not because the outcome became painless, but because it became knowable. I could measure it, prepare for it, accept it. I realized I had already been living with the anxiety of potential loss for years. The difference now was that the loss had a shape, and that made it manageable. This wasn't about winning, or proving a point, or exposing anyone. It was about reclaiming authorship of my own life. I closed the notebook and didn't open it again for several days. I didn't need to. The analysis was complete. What remained wasn't strategy, it was resolve. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sober, because clarity comes with responsibility. Once you see the truth of a situation, you can't unknow it. And you can't pretend your inaction is neutral. I also understood something else in that moment. If I stayed silent forever, I would eventually be pushed into compliance. Not through force, but through exhaustion, through emotional erosion, through the slow wearing down of alternatives. The leverage I had wasn't about confrontation. It was about timing. And timing, unlike emotion, could be controlled. From that point on, I stopped gathering information. I stopped analyzing new data. I stopped rehearsing arguments in my head. The decision was made. I would not accept a life chosen for me. I would also not beg to be understood. What I would do instead required patience, and an acceptance that once set in motion, it couldn't be undone. That was the private part, the part no one else saw. From the outside, I was still the same daughter, the same calm presence, the same reliable figure. Inside, the story had already turned. People often imagine a decision point as a moment of urgency, a deadline, a confrontation, a dramatic exchange where everything comes to a head. But my decision point arrived quietly, without witnesses, and long before anyone else realized there was a choice to be made. I didn't decide what I wanted. I had already done that. I decided how I would leave. There were several options available to me, and I examined each one carefully. I could refuse openly and immediately, state my position clearly, draw a line. That would have felt honest, but it would also have invited pressure at full force. Emotional appeals, guilt, reframing. My mother was skilled at those tools, even if she didn't see them as such. I could comply temporarily, agree in principle, while planning to withdraw later. That option carried the highest cost. It would have implicated me in a lie that affected other people. It would have eroded my self-respect. And it would have made the exit far more complicated. I could disappear gradually, create distance without explanation, let the relationship cool until expectations are dissolved. But that would have left the core issue untouched and preserved the illusion that my compliance had simply been delayed. None of those options aligned with my values. The choice I made was narrower and more final. I would wait until the ultimatum was stated plainly, not implied, not softened, not wrapped in concern. Plain, because once a choice is framed as do this or lose me, the moral responsibility shifts, the coercion becomes visible, and my refusal would no longer be misinterpreted as confusion or immaturity. This wasn't about proving a point to anyone else, it was about preserving my own clarity. I knew that when the ultimatum came, I would not negotiate. I would not argue. I would not attempt to soften the blow. I would simply choose. And I accepted that choosing myself might mean losing my mother, at least in the way I had known her. That acceptance didn't come easily. It took days of sitting with discomfort, of imagining holidays without her presence, of acknowledging grief before it officially arrived. But something else emerged alongside that grief. Relief, not the light kind. The heavy, grounding kind that comes when you stop pretending a situation is sustainable. Once the decision was made, my anxiety dropped noticeably. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't bracing for impact. I was simply ready. I also understood that there would be no clean ending. No resolution everyone could agree on. The story would fracture, and different people would carry different versions of it. I had to be comfortable with being misunderstood. That might have been the hardest part. Being seen as ungrateful, as stubborn, as selfish. Those labels had always frightened me. Now they felt survivable. The decision point wasn't marked on a calendar. No one else knew it had passed. But from that moment on, everything I did aligned with that choice. I stopped rehearsing justifications. I stopped wondering how to phrase things kindly. Kindness, I realized, doesn't require self-erasure. All that remained was the moment itself, the conversation where the ultimatum would finally be spoken aloud. And when it was, I would be ready. Not with anger, not with defiance, but with a calm that couldn't be argued with. Because the most irreversible decisions are often made long before they're announced. And mine was already complete. Once the decision was made, my behavior became almost boring. No visible changes, no emotional distance anyone could point to. If anything, I appeared more stable than ever. That was intentional. Panic draws attention. Consistency does not. I focused on logistics, quiet ones. I reviewed my finances with a level of care I hadn't needed before. I separated what was shared, clarified what was assumed, and documented what was mine. Not because I expected conflict, but because clarity prevents it. I made sure my savings were accessible, my commitments manageable, my obligations minimal. None of this required secrecy, it required discretion. At work, I formalized my position. I didn't chase titles or recognition. I solidified my value in ways that were difficult to undo. Long-term projects, institutional knowledge, responsibilities that couldn't be easily reassigned. Stability, in this context, was leverage. I also prepared emotionally, though that part was less structured. I stopped seeking reassurance. I didn't vent. I didn't ask friends what they thought I should do. I needed my resolve to be unpolluted by other people's fears or hopes. When my mother spoke about the future, I listened with neutral attentiveness. When she referenced timelines, I acknowledged them without affirming them. My responses were factual, calm, and non-committal. Yes, I hear you. I understand your concern. We'll talk when the time comes. These phrases kept the surface smooth while buying me time. From the outside, nothing appeared to be happening. Plans continued to be discussed. Assumptions remained unchallenged. My silence was read as agreement, or at least absence of resistance. That misreading was essential. I knew that once the moment arrived, there would be no gradual adjustment period. The shift would be immediate, so I allowed the illusion of continuity to persist for as long as it served me. There is a strange power in not correcting people when they misunderstand you, especially when their misunderstanding makes them less cautious. I wasn't deceiving anyone. I wasn't promising something I didn't intend to deliver. I was simply refusing to preemptively argue against a future that hadn't been formally demanded. And when it finally was, my response would not be shaped by panic or uncertainty. It would be shaped by preparation. This phase required restraint. There were moments when I wanted to speak, to assert myself, to make my position known. But I understood that early disclosure would only shift the pressure forward, not reduce it. So I waited. I lived my life as if nothing was wrong, while quietly ensuring that when everything changed, I would not be destabilized by it. That's the part people rarely see, the unglamorous work of readiness. No drama, no confrontation, just alignment between values and action. By the time my mother felt confident enough to state her terms explicitly, I had already stepped into a version of myself who no longer needed her approval to survive. She just didn't know it yet. The consequences didn't start with an explosion. They started with absence. Not mine, but theirs. The first shift was subtle enough that no one named it. Phone calls from my mother became shorter, still polite, still composed, but lighter somehow, as if something had been quietly withdrawn. She no longer asked open-ended questions. She informed rather than invited. I noticed it immediately. When expectations are no longer being negotiated, tone changes. Warmth becomes efficiency. Curiosity becomes management. She hadn't said the words yet. The ultimatum hadn't been spoken, but something in her had already moved ahead of the conversation. She was preparing for resistance or compliance and adjusting accordingly. Others began to feel it too, though they couldn't quite articulate what was wrong. Family group messages slowed. Invitations arrived later with less flexibility. Decisions that had once included my input were finalized without it. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, just a quiet reorganization of emotional access. This is how control reacts when it senses independence. Not with confrontation, but with withdrawal. I remained steady. I didn't chase the distance. I didn't ask what had changed. I let the shift exist without commentary. That, more than anything, unsettled them. People expect resistance. They don't know what to do with calm. My mother began framing conversations in terms of urgency. Not panic, but gravity. She spoke about time running out, about responsibilities becoming unavoidable, about how some doors close whether we like it or not. I listened, I acknowledged, I didn't move. That's when the pressure became perceptible to others. A relative pulled me aside once, lowering her voice. "Your mum's worried about you," she said gently. "She's under a lot of stress." I nodded. "I know." I didn't explain further. From their perspective, the story was simple. A mother trying to secure her daughter's future, and a daughter being unusually passive about it. My refusal hadn't been declared yet, so my calm looked like indifference. What they didn't see was that the decision had already been made, and that the discomfort they were sensing was the beginning of its impact. Control depends on anticipation. Once it realizes anticipation isn't working, it escalates. The conversations became more direct, still calm, still measured, but less hypothetical. "You need to start thinking seriously now. This isn't something you can delay forever. I won't always be here to protect you." That last one landed differently, not because it frightened me, but because it revealed the underlying belief that protection required obedience. I felt a familiar pang of guilt rise up, then recede. I didn't push it away. I let it pass through me without acting on it. That restraint changed the dynamic further. My mother began to speak about me more than to me. I heard about it indirectly, concern relayed through siblings, worry framed as disappointment. The narrative was being shaped without my participation. And still I remained silent. This wasn't cruelty, it was boundary setting without announcement. The consequence of my quiet resolve was that others began to feel unsteady. The version of me they relied on, the agreeable daughter, the stabilizing presence, was still physically present, but no longer emotionally adjustable. They couldn't quite name what was wrong. They just knew something wasn't aligning the way it used to. That misalignment was the beginning of the end of the old arrangement. And once it began, there was no way to reverse it, only to acknowledge it. By the time the panic surfaced, it was already too late. Not because I had shut anyone out, but because the structure they relied on no longer existed. The first sign was urgency disguised as concern. Calls that used to be brief became longer again, filled with careful wording and strategic pauses. My mother began asking questions she hadn't asked before, about my well-being, my workload, my stress levels. Not curiosity exactly, assessment. She was checking for cracks. From her perspective, something had gone wrong. The usual cues weren't working. I wasn't pushing back, but I also wasn't moving forward. That ambiguity unsettled her more than open resistance ever would have. So she tried to recalibrate. She softened her tone, reframed past comments, spoke about flexibility, about compromise. She even acknowledged, briefly, that perhaps she had come on too strong. It was the closest she had ever come to admitting pressure. But the core expectation didn't change. The outcome remained non-negotiable. That's when I knew the moment was approaching. You can tell when someone realizes they may lose control, not because they become angry, but because they become reasonable too suddenly. The shift isn't genuine openness, it's containment. She wanted to bring me back into alignment before things reached the point of no return. What she didn't realize was that I had already crossed it. When the conversation finally happened, the one she had been circling for months, it unfolded exactly as I had expected. Calm, measured, almost tender. She didn't threaten me immediately. She explained. She contextualized. She spoke about family legacy, about how much she had endured, about the sacrifices that made my life possible. I listened without interruption. Then she stated it plainly. If I refused this marriage, she would cut ties. Not in anger, not dramatically, but completely. She framed it as a consequence, not a punishment. I remember noticing how still I felt in that moment. No racing heart. No urge to defend myself. Just clarity. I told her I wouldn't do it. Not definitely. Not emotionally, just factually. The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it was final. She tried to walk it back then. Slightly. Asked if I needed time. Suggested we revisit the discussion later. Offered versions of compromise that still ended in the same place. That was the panic. She had expected tears, pleading, hesitation, something she could respond to. What she hadn't prepared for was completion. When someone has already accepted the loss you're threatening them with, the threat collapses. She didn't understand that yet. Not fully. She thought there was still room to maneuver, that the relationship could be repaired if I reconsidered. But the damage wasn't caused by my refusal. It was caused by the ultimatum itself. Once love is positioned as conditional, it can't return to what it was, even if the condition is withdrawn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her. I didn't remind her of what she was losing. I simply held my boundary. And that, more than anything, was what made it irreversible. Because in that moment, she wasn't losing control over my future. She was losing the version of me who could be controlled at all. The confrontation didn't feel like a confrontation. There were no accusations traded back and forth, no emotional spikes, no dramatic exit. If someone had been listening from another room, they might have mistaken it for a practical discussion between two calm adults. That was what made it unsettling. My mother sat very still after I refused. She didn't cry. She didn't argue immediately. She looked at me as if she were recalculating, revising a model that had always produced predictable results and suddenly didn't. You don't understand what you're doing, she said finally. Not angrily, almost gently. I do, I replied. That was it. No explanation followed. None was required. I wasn't asking for permission, and I wasn't offering justification. I had learned that explanations are invitations to negotiate, and this was not negotiable. She tried once more, softly. She reminded me of everything she had done for me, of the stability she had built, of how fragile family bonds can be when people make selfish choices. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I said something I had rehearsed only once, and only to myself. I'm grateful for what you've done. I'm still not doing this. There was no anger in my voice, no tremor, just certainty. That was when I saw it, the moment she understood that the familiar tools weren't working. Guilt didn't land. Fear didn't move me. Even love, framed as loss, had lost its leverage. She withdrew then, not physically, but emotionally. Her posture changed. The warmth receded. The conversation ended shortly after, not with resolution, but with an unspoken understanding that something fundamental had shifted. I left calmly. No slammed doors, no final words, just a quiet departure that felt heavier than any argument could have been. In the days that followed, communication dropped to a minimum. Necessary messages only, formal, distant. as if we were relearning how to speak to each other without the old assumptions. I didn't chase reconciliation. That might sound cold, but it wasn't. It was respectful. I had drawn a line, and crossing it, by pleading for acceptance, would have undermined its meaning. What surprised me most was how stable I felt. I had expected grief to be overwhelming. And there was sadness, yes, a deep, steady ache. But it wasn't chaos. It was clean, uncomplicated by doubt. I had chosen with my eyes open. That gave me peace. People often believe that standing your ground requires aggression. Those boundaries must be defended loudly to hold. I learned the opposite. Calm is disarming. When you refuse to perform outrage, there's nothing to push against. When you don't escalate, control has nowhere to go. My mother didn't become a villain in that moment. She became human, limited, frightened, unable to imagine a version of love that didn't involve authority. And I didn't become defiant. I became independent. That distinction mattered to me, because this wasn't about the winning against her. It was about not losing myself. I didn't become someone new overnight. There was no reinvention montage, no dramatic liberation. Life continued in ordinary ways: work, routines, small decisions made without consulting anyone else. And yet, everything felt subtly different. Lighter, not because the loss didn't matter, but because I was no longer carrying the weight of pretending. In the months that followed, my relationship with my mother remained distant, cordial, restrained, undefined. We spoke occasionally, carefully, as if navigating unfamiliar ground. The warmth that once existed didn't return in the same form, but neither did hostility. I learned to live with that ambiguity. What changed most wasn't my circumstances. It was my internal posture. I no longer oriented my decisions around anticipated approval. I no longer filtered my wants through the question of how they would be received. That shift affected everything. At work, I spoke more directly. Not louder, just clearer. I didn't over-explain. I didn't soften conclusions that were already well considered. People responded differently, not with resistance, but with attention. In my personal life, I noticed how much energy I had once spent managing expectations. Without that drain, I became more present, more selective, more honest about what I could and couldn't offer. I also became more compassionate, ironically not less. When you stop living in fear of withdrawal, you stop resenting the people who once held that power over you. I could see my mother more clearly now, not as an authority to appease, but as a person shaped by her own constraints and fears. That clarity didn't excuse her behavior, but it freed me from internal conflict. I didn't need her to understand my choice in order to stand by it. The version of me that emerged from this wasn't harder or colder. It was steadier, less reactive, less porous. I learned that dignity doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, once you stop bargaining with yourself. There were moments of grief, holidays that felt incomplete, conversations that never happened. I didn't rush past those feelings. I let them exist without trying to resolve them. Because choosing yourself doesn't eliminate loss. It clarifies it. And clarity, even when it hurts, is a form of respect. I no longer define myself by being the easy one, or the reliable one, or the daughter who understands. I define myself by alignment between what I value and how I live. That alignment has a quiet confidence to it. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to be defended. It simply is. There's a temptation, when telling stories like this, to search for a clean moral, a clear lesson that wraps everything up neatly and makes the loss feel worthwhile. Real life doesn't offer that kind of symmetry. What it offers instead is understanding, earned slowly, often at a cost. If there's one truth I carried out of this experience, it's this. Love that survives only through compliance isn't love that can sustain you. It may look stable, it may feel familiar, but it asks you to disappear in small ways over time until the person left is easier to manage than to know. I don't believe my mother set out to hurt me. I believe she acted from fear of uncertainty, of social judgment, of losing relevance in a world she understood through structure and control. In her mind, she was protecting me. But protection that requires surrender isn't protection. It's containment. The hardest part of this journey wasn't saying no to the marriage. It was saying yes to the possibility of loss. Accepting that choosing myself might mean being misunderstood, judged, or emotionally cut off by someone I loved. That acceptance changed everything. Once you stop negotiating your autonomy for approval, you discover something surprising. The world doesn't collapse. The ground doesn't disappear beneath you. You grieve, but you also grow, quietly. I didn't win anything. I didn't reclaim a relationship in a better form. I didn't emerge triumphant. What I gained was authorship. The right to make irreversible decisions about my own life without needing to justify them to anyone else. And that, I've learned, is a form of dominance that doesn't raise its voice. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, if you've ever been told that love requires obedience or that duty outweighs desire, I want you to know something. Clarity is not cruelty, boundaries are not betrayal, and choosing yourself does not make you ungrateful. It makes you whole. I'm sharing this story not as instruction, but as testimony. Because sometimes hearing that someone else survived the loss you're afraid of makes it easier to imagine surviving it yourself. So I'll leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been asked to give up a future you didn't choose in order to keep someone's love?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ